Good afternoon, class. We'll pick up where we left off today. We're talking particularly about the Middle East, or Southwest Asia and Northern Africa, the former Ottoman Empire. And we're looking at this region at a particularly revealing period in early modern world history, where we're looking at the late 1800s, the early 1900s, which was a very fateful time for this region because we know that events in the world, such as industrialization and the modernization of many parts of the world that are either being directly impacted by Europe in the form of colonies and the role that European countries take in ruling their colonies, but also just by the example and the forcefulness by which European countries are growing during this time. So really all of the world is going to be impacted by this, and the Middle East is perhaps a really revealing region for us to focus on to see this play out on the world stage. So we also know that World War I is going to be grounds for pause, particularly by the people of Western society and the countries of Europe and the United States that comprise it. World War I serves as a time for taking inventory and seeing, what is becoming of all this modernization, all of this industrialization. Perhaps it's not all that it seemed to be cracked up to be when defenders of modernization were making their case throughout the late 1700s and much of the 1800s. So today we're looking at this region, and we talked a little bit in class about the difference between principle and pragmatism, and how regions such as the former Ottoman Empire is in a real difficult situation where it's crumbling, it's losing its power. But not only is it losing its power, it's also losing its pieces. It's literally falling apart and being taken over by its neighbors, and some of those neighbors are European countries to the northwest of the Ottoman Empire. And so the Ottomans are faced with this difficult choice between, do we adhere to principle, which this is our area, and end of story, we'll fight to the death to remain united as an empire, or should we be more pragmatic? Maybe we can give a little bit and find some different ways to perhaps make lemonade out of these otherwise lemons that were being served at this time in history. I also want you to realize that this entire region is complicated by the fact that there are a number of different ethnic groups, and perhaps what's confusing is almost all of these ethnic groups, when we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, are Islamic, meaning they are culturally, they share a religion of sorts. Although there's a couple things to point out. The first is the obvious exception, and that is the Armenians, who are essentially of the eastern region of what is nowadays Turkey. They were not a Muslim ethnic group. They're actually a Christian ethnic group, so they should be thought of a little differently. But the other complicating matter is that even within Islam, there are some pretty powerful divides, such as that exists between the Sunni and the Shiite people. And I will leave my comments, I will stay silent on that, but if you would like a brief explanation of the difference between the Shiite and the Sunni people, I'll be happy to give that sometime tomorrow or beyond. Okay, so we're looking at this region and how it's going to respond. We talked about the experience of Turkey, the Young Turks, the reforms of Mustafa Kemal, and how he really transforms the Ottoman Empire, which was formerly a great empire of many different peoples, and he sort of strips it down and focuses on the Turkish people themselves, which were the dominant ethnic group within the former Ottoman Empire. But now the newly formed Republic of Turkey is going to take shape in the early 20th century and be a very important player, at least an important player as far as the nationalist responses of the people of the Middle East are concerned. So if we move on then to our second region of the Middle East, we're looking at Persia, which is is going to, in 1925, no longer be thought of as Persia, which is kind of an ancient reference, but it will form the modern country of Iran. Okay, and what's going on in the former Persian Empire, which was ruled by the Qajar dynasty, it's important to understand there's three different players essentially that are a part of the story. So if we're going to talk about the key challenges that Persia experiences on its road to becoming Iran in 1925, there's really three different interest groups. There's the Shah, who is essentially the ruling power within the Persian dynasty under the Qajar dynasty. Then there are the Shiites, who are a majority ethnic group. Shiite Islam is a version of Islam. It's actually a minority sect of Islam, but it's powerful. And in Iran, even today, the majority of Muslims in that country are, in fact, Shiite. And there's a tension between the Shah and the Shiites. You can think of the Shiites as being sort of the traditionalists and the Puritans who want to see Persian society remain very similar to how it was. But then you have the Shah, who is very much under the influence of foreign countries. Both Russia and the British have a growing presence and a growing set of interests that they express within the late Persian dynasty of the Qajar dynasty. So you have the Shiites sort of against the Shah, but then you have a third group, and these are sort of the modern, call them the modernizers, sort of the elites that don't want to see Persia remain stuck in sort of the old cultural dated practices that the Shiites would desire. But at the same time, this middle group, the modernizers, don't want to see the future of the Persian dynasty dictated by outside forces. So there's like a three-way tug-of-war that's going on here. And so all of these are going to make for a difficult recipe for, addressing the future of the Persian Qajar dynasty. And the way that this all works out between these three groups, the Shah, the modernizers, and the Shiites, is essentially there will be some success made by the modernizers. In fact, they're going to be able to implement a new constitution that's going to take root within the very end of the Qajar dynasty. And this is going to have allow for a certain measure of political and economic reforms that are central to what those modernizers would like. But at the same time, unfortunately, the experience of this region is going to be complicated by the discovery of oil in 1908. And what this means is that outside presence of both the Russian and British interests within the region are going to come to have a tremendous amount of clout and influence. In 1925, the modernizers will succeed in toppling the Qajar dynasty and bringing about a new, somewhat reformed society under a new dynasty called the Pahlavis. But what's going to happen is Iran, which it can now be called starting in 1925, is going to suffer from a strong foreign presence. Spheres of influence will be established by the British and Russian presence within this region. And I bring this up, we don't really have a neat resolution to the story, but part of what we're trying to explain here is the frustration and anger and distrust that much of the modern Middle East demonstrates with regard to its relationship with the West. And so this feeling of various parts of the Middle East being treated sort of as resource grounds and as regions that are there to do the bidding of more powerful Western countries, this is something that has not disappeared. And these are histories that are told and remembered and passed along by people within this region. And it helps explain some of the anti-Western sentiment that's there. Now, to take this even further, this idea of where some of the current angst and frustration from this world region, where it comes from or what it's based in, we can look at a very important chapter in the history of the Middle East, and that is following World War I. And essentially, the Middle East is a uniquely revealing chapter, because what happens following World War I is oil has just recently been discovered. We know that in the Persian Empire, which has now turned into Iran, in 1908 oil was discovered there. That immediately made this part of the world a very important place, a very important sphere for various European countries. In fact, the Brits during World War I are going to place protection, troops that occupy various parts of both Iraq and Iran, simply because they don't want the Germans to have access to the oil-rich regions where oil has already been discovered in Iran. Okay, so really the interests that happen here are you have different groups of people, most of whom are Muslim, but they're different varieties of Muslim. So we have Arabs, we have within it the Islamic faith, we have Shiites and Sunnis, we have Kurds, we have we have Egyptians, we have different groups of people that don't necessarily see their world the same way. We might, from an outside perspective, think, oh yeah, but they're all Muslims. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone is going to exist harmoniously and see the world the same way. Also, now we have oil that's been injected in here, and because of oil, we have Europeans who really want to see this region remain stable, because it's only through stability that they can extract the oil and see, derive profit and benefit from this area. So Iraq is going to be brought into this discussion, partly because of its proximity to Iran, and eventually in Iraq there will even be oil discovered there, which will make Iraq not just indirectly involved, but also directly involved in the European powers that are trying to control it. Now, after World War I, the European countries established mandates, which were essentially overseen by the League of Nations. And what a mandate means is it's like you give a country or a region a babysitter. And so there was a British mandate that was installed in the Middle East, and the Brits took over, and you could call it a babysitting relationship, of Palestine, Jordan, and then this even reached farther to the east, all the way into Iraq. And then we have up here a French mandate, which was Lebanon and Syria across into a little bit of just portions of Iran. So this is, of course, from the standpoint of someone in the Middle East, this is a very insulting relationship. It suggests that the European countries can help themselves and oversee and maintain a presence in these areas that were formerly possessions of the Ottoman Empire, but now that the Ottomans have shriveled up and reformed under a much smaller Turkey, these areas consisting of people who thought they would be free and independent, these ethnic groups would establish sort of a new place for themselves, are now finding themselves in the insulting relationship of this. Saudi Arabia will maintain something of an exception, and their Wahhabi past creates a much more forceful resistance to European power, and we'll talk about that more as we proceed in the course and get to the late 20th century. Thank you.